Hey guys, tonight we're heading back in time way back to a place where the air smells faintly of parchment, incense, and cheese. You find yourself trudging up a winding, muddy path toward a stone abbey, its squat towers nestled beneath. A sky that can't decide whether to snow or weep. The bells have just finished tolling vespers, and a light flickers in the scriptorium window as monks shuffle past, cowls drawn low, clutching bundles wrapped in cloth. One of them is clearly carrying a wheel of cheese. You don't question it. You're here for the long, slow unraveling of why medieval monks needed so many types of cheese, and if you're not sleepy yet, well, you probably won't survive. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is. Drop it in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step inside the monastery, and it's not the chapel that draws your eye, it's the kitchen. Long wooden tables, copper cauldrons still steaming, and off to one side, a cool little room where monks are fussing over wheels of cheese as if they were relics. And in a way, they are. The reason monks had so many cheeses wasn't because they were hosting parties, or at least not the wild kind. It came down to a blend of necessity, practicality, and yes, spiritual discipline. You'll see. Let's start with the vibe. Medieval monasteries were cold, quiet places. Not silent, exactly. There was chanting and coughing and the occasional donkey bray from the stables, but for the most part, these were slow, steady spaces filled with repetition and ritual. The kind of place where your heartbeat starts to sync with the rhythm of daily bells. Food, naturally, had to be managed with just as much care. And here's the kicker. Meat was frowned upon. Monks were often restricted to vegetarian diets, especially in stricter orders like the Cistercians and Benedictines. Fish was allowed, but not always available. Eggs and dairy became their lifeline, and cheese was both storage-friendly and deeply adaptable. Now imagine being a monk in, say, 11th century Normandy. You've got cows, you've got time, and you've got a lot of theological debates to sit through. Cheese becomes more than food, it's a process. Something physical and purposeful to do between prayers. It gave monks a way to labor with their hands while keeping their minds on scripture. Cheese also had longevity. You could salt and age it, tuck it into cool cellars, and come back months later to a still edible if slightly suspicious meal. It was edible theology, really. A food shaped by time, patience, and invisible forces. And the diversity? That came from terrain, climate, and cow. Alpine monasteries made hard cheeses that could survive the journey to Rome. Coastal abbeys favored softer, saltier wheels. Some used sheep's milk, others goat. The result? Dozens if not hundreds of cheese varieties, each tailored to its own tiny cloistered world. And no two batches were ever exactly the same. Here's a fun aside. Monks didn't always name their cheeses. It wasn't St. Dunstan's Delight or Abbey Blue. It was more like the hard one from last winter, or that soft batch that smells like Father Thomas' shoes. Descriptive, if not exactly marketable. One fringe tidbit. Some monasteries kept cheese logs, not the edible kind, but actual ledgers where they recorded the characteristics of each batch, almost like a dairy version of wine tasting. Notes like mild, grassy, persistent rind bloom, or smells of damp hay and divine punishment. And yes, historians still argue whether cheesemaking was officially prescribed by monastic rules or just something that happened organically and fermentedly over time. Some point to vague references in the rule of Saint Benedict. Others think it was just monks being practical with excess milk. You glance around the monastery kitchen, A novice is kneeling beside a churn, another is wiping down a slaked shelf in the cheese room. It's dim, cool, and smells faintly of salt and straw. Outside, the rain begins again, tapping against the leaded glass windows in a slow rhythm. You find your breath matching its pace. Inhale, exhale. Somewhere, someone is praying in Latin. Somewhere else, a wheel of cheese is slowly aging into perfection. And you? You're just getting started. You shift slightly on the wooden bench beside the hearth, watching a thin curl of smoke rise from the fire and drift toward the stone ceiling. The warmth is welcome, your cloak's still damp around the hem, and your toes have lost all feeling. But the cheese is calling. Not with words, of course, but with presence. Rows of wheels and wedges and suspicious lumps, all stacked on wooden planks like silent sentinels of some dairy-based order. The cheese room, more formally called the larder, or caesarium, is a place of reverence here. Not flashy. Just cool, clean, and orderly, like a chapel with curdled aspirations. It's here that monks perform their sacred act of culinary preservation, all in slow, careful steps that might look, to an outsider, like very devout witchcraft. You notice that not all cheeses are created equal. Some are pale and soft, their surfaces dimpled like the knees of a saint. Others are hard, waxy, and lined with deep cracks that suggest they've been through something. Each has a texture, a scent, a moisture level, and all of that carefully cultivated. You wouldn't want to anger the abbot by slicing into a wheel. Before its time, let's talk technique. Monks didn't invent cheese. But boy, did they refine it? You've probably heard of cheeses like Port Salut, Trappist, or even Munster. Yes, the stinky one. All those have monastic roots. It started simple. Milk was curdled using rennet, often taken from a calf's stomach, though sometimes fig sap or vinegar was used, then strained through cloth, salted, and pressed. But like all good rituals, it got elaborate. Time, humidity, flipping schedules, brushing techniques. Monks turned cheese aging into an art form. Here's a mainstream fact. Many monasteries had cheese masters, much like cellar masters in a vineyard. These weren't just kitchen hands. These were men of serious standing, entrusted with watching over the aging wheels the same way a librarian guards rare scrolls. And if you're wondering how they knew when a cheese was ready, well, it involved tapping, sniffing, and yes, occasionally whispering to it. Or so the stories go. After all, if prayer could move mountains, maybe it could coax a bloomy rind into existence. The cheeses were not just for the monks themselves. While many stayed within the walls to feed the cloistered community, surplus rounds were sold or traded to locals, often through lay brothers who handled the outside world. Some monasteries grew famous for their cheese, drawing nobles and peasants alike who were willing to trade coin or goods for a taste of that sacred tang dot and yes, quirky tidbit. Incoming, some monasteries had cheese, so popular that it was protected under early versions of what we now call geographical indication laws. Think only from this abbey cheese. It's like brie, if brie came with a side of Gregorian chant. But cheese wasn't just food. It was currency, a tax, a tithe, a bribe even. One abbot in the 12th century reportedly negotiated a peace treaty with a rival monastery using an aged Gouda the size of a small dog. Was it exaggeration? Possibly. But imagine the leverage. Yield your manuscripts, or we cut the cheese. Even the monastery calendar was shaped by dairy. Lent, Advent, Ember. Days all had different food rules. Sometimes dairy was allowed, sometimes not. During dairy fast periods, monks had to get clever. Some developed cheese alternatives from almond milk. Others bent the rules slightly, arguing that if a cheese was made before Lent, then technically, Eating it during Lent didn't count. Historians still argue whether this was clever moral reasoning or just very hungry logic. You lean toward the latter, especially after imagining 40 days of barley soup and boiled beets. You watch one of the younger monks take a wheel off the shelf. He thumps it gently with a knuckle, sniffs it, and sets it down on a clean board. Then he slices a wedge with a slow, reverent motion. The inside is soft and pale yellow, like sun-warmed butter. It smells of hay, old cellars, and maybe, just maybe, redemption. There's a silence that follows. Not awkward, just contemplative. You can almost hear the cheese thinking. Outside, the mist still hangs low over the fields, turning the landscape into a watercolor of stone walls and wind-blown trees. Inside, your breath joins the soft hum of a monastery at work, pages turning, ladle stirring, beeswax candles gently guttering. You let your eyes drift over the tools of the trade. Cheese molds carved from wood. Wire cutters hung beside jars of coarse salt. A copper pot, blackened from years of fires, sits in the corner, its surface faintly crusted with ancient curd. Everything smells faintly alive, milky, fermented, kind of like history itself. You take another breath and imagine what it's like to wake up every morning not to the clang of alarms, but to the soft tolling of a bell, a routine that includes prayer, reading, and pressing curds into circular devotion. And you think, not for the last time, these monks might have had the quietest lives, but they knew how to age a story into something beautiful. You step outside the cheese room and into the cloister walk, where soft leather solace echo faintly against flagstones slick with condensation. A single bell chimes in the distance tierce maybe. It's hard to keep track. Time here moves like warmed honey, slow and undemanding, broken only by prayer and the occasional sneeze from a dusty monk in the library. But right now, your thoughts are still full of cheese. The thing is, it wasn't just about having a cheese. Oh no. Medieval monastic communities needed types of cheese, plural. Each kind had a purpose, a season, a specific moment of liturgical or digestive significance. Cheese was a lifestyle, a theology, a very edible form of timekeeping. A window. Ledge where a small wheel of something gray and fuzzy is resting on a wooden board. Not forgotten, just aging. Monks weren't careless with their curds. This one's probably a blue though in this century. Blue really meant questionably spotted and vaguely supernatural. Mainstream fact, monastic cheesemaking helped standardize aging techniques. That gave us modern cheese categories: soft ripened, washed rind, hard pressed. What began as trial and error, oops, we left it in the cave too long, became something like sacred routine. Cheeses were flipped daily, brushed with brine. Some were rubbed with ale or wine, not for the flavor, but to ward off undesirable molds. If the cheese happened to absorb some flavor, well, divine accident. And oh, the naming conventions. You peek into a storeroom where a few shelves bear chalked labels. Wheel 6, Lent batch, mild saint, test batch, goat number 3. Some sound like wine labels, others like rejected band names. But behind each one is a purpose. Monks didn't just make cheese, they made cheese for fasting days, cheese for feast days, cheese for travel, for trade, for children, for elders who could no longer chew. 1. Wheel was known informally as toothless brother, made especially soft and mild for the older monks who'd lost more than their worldly possessions over the years. Quirky tidbit? Some monasteries developed cheeses that aged in their own sealed crocks, buried underground to absorb the temperature of the earth itself. Retrieving them was like unearthing edible treasure. Some say this method produced cheese so intense it had to be eaten in a separate room. You suspect those monks were just looking for an excuse to eat in peace. Historians still argue whether all these varieties were intentional culinary planning, or if monks just hated wasting milk and said, "Let's age this one and see what happens." You move through the cloister's garden now, and the breeze carries the sharp tang of mint and nettle. Herbal plots were a monastic staple, but they weren't just for medicine or tea. Some herbs found their way into cheese. A wheel flecked with garlic mustard, another rolled in crushed sage. Not to mention nettle-wrapped cheeses, which gave a subtle bitterness and ensured the cheese could be stored in a bundle. Without sticking, you pause beside a small statue of Saint Benedict, moss nibbling at the hem of his stone robe. It's fitting, really. Benedictine monasteries were often at the center of culinary innovation, not because they loved decadence, but because they believed in order, in rhythm, in the sanctity of daily tasks done with care. Cheese wasn't luxury. It was devotion. With a rhyme dot, and if you're wondering how many cheeses a single abbey could produce, the answer varies. Some made one type per season. Others kept 5 or 6 batches going at once, rotating through recipes the way you might rotate between playlists. Imagine a medieval monk standing in the cellar, tapping a wheel and muttering, "No, Brother Zhang. This one's not for supper. This one's for Epiphany." Try not to eat it early again. You stop beside a covered stone basin where someone set down a small basket. Inside cloth-wrapped parcels, probably cheeses ready for delivery. You lift one. It's warm from the sun and smells faintly of butter and straw. The packaging methods are worth a nod too. Some monasteries used beeswax-sealed parchment. Others wrapped cheese in cabbage leaves. One abbey even used strips of linen soaked in salt water and rosemary, which kept pests away and made the cheese smell like a forest picnic. Clever dot, and then, of course, there was the issue of labeling. Not everyone had access to ink and vellum. Some monks scratched identifiers into the rind itself, or used patterns of holes punched with pins to mark the cheese's origin or date. A sort of braille for dairy fanatics. You pass another monk in the corridor, this one carrying a covered bucket. He nods at you, the bucket swinging gently from a strap over his shoulder. It sloshes faintly. You wonder, fresh milk? Brine? Maybe. Way to feed the pigs. Nothing in a monastery ever truly goes to waste. As you turn a corner, you spot a small alcove, probably once used for prayer, now holding shelves of salt. Big, chunky crystals in wooden bowls. Salt was vital for cheese making. It dried the surface, slowed bacteria, hardened rinds, added flavor. But salt wasn't always easy to come by. Some monasteries sourced theirs from coastal merchants, others from inland salt mines with reputations darker than the brine pits themselves. One monk once wrote that a bad batch of salt could ruin an entire season of cheese. Another claimed the wrong salt could call demons into the curds. You suspect he just hated the taste of cheap rock salt. The candlelight flickers against the walls as you make your way back toward the main hall. The smell of cheese is still in your nostrils. Fermented milk, cool air, dried herbs, and faint mold. It's not unpleasant. It's history, layered in dairy. And so you continue your slow, steady walk through a place where silence reigns and cheese matures in patient shadows. You pause a moment near the archway that separates the cloisters from the outer yard, one hand resting on the cool stone as a faint breeze weaves its way through the passage. The scent of damp soil, straw, and barnyard animals creeps in, just subtle enough to let you know that outside these calm walls, monastic life includes far more than chance and contemplation. It includes cows, goats, and quite possibly a very grumpy donkey named Alfred, because cheese doesn't begin in the cellar. It begins in the pasture. Step by slow step, you make your way out toward the livestock enclosures. The path winds gently, flanked by rows of flat stones set into the earth like vertebrae of some buried beast. Your boots scuff against moss and, ahead of you, two novice monks, barely out of boyhood, struggle to guide a reluctant brown cow toward the milking stall. The cow, naturally, is winning. Mainstream historical fact: medieval monasteries often maintained their own herds of dairy. Cows and goats, not only for milk but for dung, labor, and leather. Cows were prized possessions, and some monasteries kept records of their milk output nearly as carefully as their psalms. Goats, too, were common, especially in rockier regions where cows couldn't graze well, and sheep? They got their own. Fame for wool, but occasionally lent a hand, or rather, an udder to the cheese game as well. You trail behind the boys, passing a low stone wall where two hens perch like gossips. Beyond, the barn stands open, its wide wooden doors pulled back to reveal orderly chaos. Buckets, stools, troughs, piles of hay, and the distinct rhythmic creak of someone already at the milking bench. Inside, a monk in russet robes is calmly coaxing milk from a goat while humming something faintly off-key. You give a nod. He nods back. The goat does not acknowledge you. Quirky tidbit? Some monasteries gave their cows names and tracked their personality traits in ledgers. Brother Marcus, for example, once wrote that a particular cow named Clarabelle demonstrated piety and mildness, but stubborn in matters of gate crossing. Another monk, possibly in jest, recorded a goat's confession of sins, including knocking over the brine tub, and absolved it with a handful of oats. You step into the stall next to the milking bench and lean briefly against a beam, watching as pale streams fill a wooden pail. Milk at this stage was a precious commodity. It couldn't sit long, it had to be heated or curdled, turned into butter, drunk fresh, or preferably transformed into cheese before it spoiled. Which brings you to the tools of the trade. Hanging. Neatly on a rack are the essentials. Shallow pans for separating cream, iron ladles, cloth strainers, and wooden forms carved with swirling patterns to mark the cheese before aging. Some monks took immense pride in these carvings. One abbot insisted that the emblem of Saint Gertrude be pressed into every wheel produced during her feast week. Whether Saint Gertrude approved of being immortalized in dairy is unknown. Historians still argue whether these carved forms were purely symbolic, or whether they functioned as early branding and ecclesiastical logo of sorts. Either way, they were beautiful and often sticky. You lift a small cheese mold and turn it in your hands. It smells faintly of whey and ash. The monks here use a mixture of ash and salt to coat certain wheels, especially soft ones. The ash draws out moisture, encourages the right molds, and looks, if you're being honest, quite dramatic. Further back in the barn, a novice hauls in a bundle of fresh hay, muttering to himself about Brother Cedric's boot again. Apparently, someone's lost footwear is now embedded in a haystack. You don't ask questions. Hay does as it pleases. You step back out into the yard, blinking at the light. Clouds still drift overhead, but the mist has lifted, and the air is full of birdsong and the faint mooing of a cow in mild protest. You head toward the herb shed, because milk alone does not a cheese make. In the little thatched hut, bundles of thyme, rosemary, and lovage hang from beams, drying slowly. A small mortar and pestle sit on the workbench next to a lidded jar labeled rennet calves. You lift the lid and wince. It's rennet all right, the dried lining of a young calf's stomach, essential for turning milk into curds. And, yes, it smells exactly how you expect something called calf enzyme to smell, like science. And regret, rennet was precious stuff. Most monasteries had a designated monk to collect and prepare it, sometimes trading extra jars to nearby manors or churches. Getting the dosage right was part science, part prayer, and part experience. Too little, and the curds wouldn't form. Too much, and the cheese turned rubbery and mean. You close the jar and step away. Gently dot outside. Near the edge of the orchard, you notice something unusual. A small fenced-in area with a series of troughs. Inside, several wheels of cheese are soaking in brine saltwater baths designed to harden rinds and season the curds. The water smells earthy, faintly sweet. Some brines were reused for months, becoming like sourdough starters, each batch of cheese slightly different because of the old brine's character. One monk, you remember, claimed his brine was aged to wisdom. Another described it as suspicious but effective. A third simply wrote, "Do not taste directly." Brother Simon did, and he no longer enjoys breakfast. You walk past the brine station, arms folded, mind swirling with images of cheese being born from grass and sun and sweat and elbow grease. This isn't just food, it's a rhythm. A slow, seasonal symphony performed with wooden tools and stubborn animals and the endless patience of monks in sandals. And as you return toward the cloisters, the goat bleats once long and low as if to remind you, without us, your cheese dreams curdle. You step back into the cloisters with your boots slightly damp and your hands still carrying the faint scent of goat, hay, and brine. The stone corridor welcomes you like an old friend, cool, echoing, and lined with uneven shadows cast by the high afternoon sun filtering through arched windows. You walk slowly now, your pace unconsciously aligning with the rhythm of monastic life. Unhurried, deliberate, steeped in repetition. As you pass the small chapel entrance, you hear the faint rise and fall of plain song, voices like a distant breeze brushing across the tops of wheat fields. Inside, a handful of monks chant the officium, their tones flowing seamlessly, voices overlapping in peaceful harmony. It's easy to forget that somewhere, not far from these harmonies, someone is skimming curds off warm milk with a ladle carved out of pearwood, because life in the monastery is divided, often quite literally, between the sacred and the smelly. Mainstream historical fact? In many medieval monasteries, labor was seen as both a spiritual discipline and a practical necessity. The rule of Saint Benedict outlined a balance between prayer, study, and manual work ora et labora. And for many monks, that meant spending part of the day in the choir and another part ankle-deep in whey. Divine service and dairy service were not mutually exclusive. You reach a corner where the cloister walk turns sharply left and reveals the monastery's small kitchen garden. Tidy rows of herbs stretch in raised beds, their scents curling into the warm air. Sage, marjoram, mint, a touch of chive. A young monk is bent over a patch of garlic, his face mostly hidden by the broad straw hat slipping low on his brow. As he digs gently around the roots, he hums the same tune you heard in the barn earlier. You think it might be about cheese. Or God. Possibly both. There's something reassuring in the repetition here. Garlic grows the way it always has. The sun creeps across the same sundial mounted to the stone wall. And the cheese matures in the cellar at the Bia. Same slow, stubborn pace it has for centuries. You pause under a fig tree near the garden wall, its leaves trembling faintly in the breeze. The figs are still green, not yet ripe, but the idea of them with a slice of aged hard cheese makes your mouth water faintly. Sweet and sharp, soft and dry. The monks, of course, wouldn't have called it a pairing. They just knew what tasted good after a long fast. Quirky tidbit? Some monastic orders had very specific cheese calendars. For example, during Lent, or other fasting periods when meat was prohibited, cheese, especially soft or fresh cheeses, was sometimes permitted. But only certain types at certain times. There are records of abbots debating the moral weight of blue mold versus washed rind. One even ruled that overly ripe cheese was too passionate for Lent and might lead to impure thoughts. Honestly, he was probably just sensitive to strong smells. You walk past a wooden door partly ajar, revealing the flicker of torchlight within a preparation room, not quite kitchen, not quite pantry. Here, monks press cloths over curds, slice cheese wheels with long iron wires, and gently rotate cheeses in their molds to ensure even settling. A tall brother with a saffron-colored sash is carefully dusting ash onto a large disc of cheese, muttering a prayer that sounds suspiciously like a recipe. You note the row of wine jugs along the back wall, modest, earthy, and slightly dusty. Cheese, after all, was rarely consumed alone. And while the monks rarely overindulged, they knew full well that a wedge of firm sheep's cheese tastes divine with a cup of dark, young wine. Particularly if you've spent the day dodging particularly aggressive chickens. Historians still argue whether monastic cheese production was ever fully separated from monastic consumption. That is, were monks making cheese for the glory of God, or the glory of lunch? Some say the cheese was entirely for trade or almsgiving. Others suggest that a sizable portion ended up sliced on trenchers in the refectory, possibly with a side of pickled onions. Neither side is particularly wrong, or particularly hungry. You leave the shade of the fig tree and head toward the northern building, the one half sunk into the hill, with arched doorways and thick wooden shutters closed tight against the sun. You know what lies beyond that door. The cheese cellar. You lift the iron latch, push the heavy door open, and are immediately greeted by the cool hush of stone and shadow. The air is dense and still, like holding your breath underwater, and the smell earthy, fermented, complex, and not entirely explainable wraps around you like a robe. This is where cheese comes to rest, to change, to bloom. On rows of wooden shelves sit the fruits of weeks, sometimes months of careful labor. Some wheels are small and white, still soft and slightly bulging in the middle. Others are massive, banded in cloth, thick with dust and cobwebs, their rinds firm and scarred with age. A few are speckled with herbs. One appears to have a rind entirely made of crushed walnut shells. You walk slowly down the central aisle, fingers brushing over the air just above the wheels. You don't touch, not because you're not tempted, but because Brother Josias once slapped a hand away with a ladle faster than you thought possible. And he didn't even look up from his book. You pause near a stack of hard cheeses, each one marked with a faded date and a tiny sigil, some kind of spiral. The cheese hums faintly in the silence. Not literally, of course. Probably at the back of the cellar, you find a wheel wrapped in linen and beeswax, marked with red dye in the shape of a lily. You know what this one is. The celebratory cheese. Aged for a full year, opened only on the Feast of St. Cuthbert. Firm, sharp, slightly smoky. And never, ever sliced before the bell. You close your eyes and breathe it all in. The past, the milk, the ash, the air. It's not just food. It's a ritual, a record, a legacy written in. Curds and timed out, and just like that, your stomach growls. You leave the cellar behind with a reverent sort of hush still clinging to your robes. Or maybe it's just the smell of ammoniated rind, you're not quite sure anymore. Back out in the open air, the drizzle has fully stopped, replaced by a low golden glow as the late afternoon sun dips behind the treetops. Everything sparkles just a little now. Even the mud seems faintly blessed. You wander toward the refectory, not because it's mealtime, though your stomach is now lobbying for representation, but because that's where the day's cheese, in its many forms, often made its way before vanishing down the cloaked gullets of the monastic community. The refectory itself is long and austere, its wooden beams darkened with centuries of candle smoke. But it's not grim. Light streams through the tall windows in softened rays, illuminating dust motes and the steady procession of simple oak tables. The air here smells of old bread, dried lavender, wax, and something you've come to recognize fondly, slightly. Overripe cheese that someone forgot to cover as you step inside. Your eye catches a small cart to the left beside the salt barrel. Upon it, covered with a damp cloth, are the remains of lunch. A few slices of rye bread, the heel of a baked apple, and 3 half-eaten cheese rinds, each one utterly different. One crumbles with a sharp edge, likely aged goat. Another has melted slightly into the cloth, leaving behind a butter-yellow stain and a smell that could be illegal. The third is blue, and appears to be plotting something. Mainstream historical fact? Monasteries across medieval Europe were known for their cheese variety, soft, fresh cheeses like quark, firm, hard cheeses like Tom, and blues with veining. Introduced by methods that likely involved rye bread and more than a little divine intervention. The variety was partly due to local climate, partly to experimentation, and partly, let's face it, to monks being both bored and competitive. Quirky. Tidbit? There are accounts half documented, half legendary of cheese duels between monasteries. Not with weapons, mind you, but rather subtle competitions where monks would send wheels of their best cheese to another abbey and await a verdict. Some would go so far as to include poems with the shipment, often in Latin, praising their own cheese while lightly mocking the recipient's last attempt. One verse even compared a rival's cheese to a holy relic of questionable origin. Blessed. Perhaps, but difficult to chew. You smile at the image, solemn monks exchanging, taunting cheese sonnets between Vespers and Compline. Historians still argue whether such cheese diplomacy had any real social impact beyond friendly ribbing. Some believe it fostered a spirit of regional cooperation and innovation. Others think it was mostly an excuse to sneak in a few extra bites between fasts. What's clear is that cheese wasn't just food, it was communication, craftsmanship, and quiet defiance, all wrapped up in linen and rind. You move to the far side of the refectory, where the serving niche is an arched opening in the wall through which plates are passed from the kitchen. A young novice appears on the other side, arms full of bowls. He spots you, grins, and nods toward a basket by the arch. Inside it, a wedge of what looks like soft sheep's cheese wrapped in fig leaves. The daily leftover, likely set aside for charitable giving or hungry wanderers. You nod your thanks and retrieve the wedge, cradling it like a relic. The leaf is slightly damp, the cheese within dense and yielding to the touch. You take a small bite. Tangy, earthy, slightly lemony. Definitely worth a song. You exit the refectory and step into a narrow walkway between 2 stone buildings, brushing crumbs from your sleeves as you go. The stone is warm here, still holding on to the day's sun, and for a moment you're enveloped in golden silence. You pass a high window, cracked open to let in the evening breeze. Inside, you glimpse a scriptorium, rows of desks, each one neatly arranged with quills, parchment, and ink. And on one corner, beside an inkwell, sits a small plate with cheese rinds and apple slices. Of course. Even scribes need snacks. You pause and watch as a robed figure scratches away at a manuscript with one hand while picking at a cheese wedge with the other. It's a quiet, deeply human moment, one that links you directly to the strange, sacred, and slightly smelly world. A monk sneezes. The cheese probably helped. It's strange to think how central cheese is in a place devoted to silence, prayer, and asceticism. But here, in this winding dance of Darien devotion, it fits perfectly, because cheese, like the divine, rewards patience, practice, and more than a little faith. You wander on, past a courtyard where pigeons strut proudly along the rim of a shallow fountain. One of them attempts to peck a rind someone dropped. It recoils. You suspect it found the blue one. Above you, the sky shifts again, colors deepening from amber to violet. The bells ring out across the fields. Not loud, just enough to remind. The world at time is still passing. And that maybe, somewhere, another wheel of cheese just turned slightly in its sleep. You smile. Then, as the last echo fades, you feel a familiar rumble. Time for second supper? You follow the scent of roasting barley and slightly scorched bread down a shaded cloister that opens into the monastery's outer kitchens. This isn't the sleek ceremonial kitchen where high feast days are prepared or where the abbots' mulled wine is warmed. No, this is the workhorse hearth of the monastery, the one where breakfast porridge is stirred with a stick the size of a fencing pole, and where cheese is both eaten and sometimes quietly sliced with someone's belt knife when no one's looking. The outer kitchen buzzes with motion, even in the muted rhythm of monastic life. Novices move in simple patterns, some tending to the fire, others gathering nettles or turning dough, but no one talks. There's just the soft clink of pottery, the scrape of wood against stone, and the hiss of steam from a kettle with one. Too many dents. In the far corner, a monk with arms like rolling pins is shaving curls from a block of hard, dry cheese, something aged and stubborn, likely meant for grating over gruel or disguising the texture of questionable greens. He sees you and nods toward a bench by the door where a few chunks of broken cheese rind have been thoughtfully laid out. Hospitality, monastic style, mainstream historical fact. While cheese was a staple of the medieval monastic diet, it wasn't always the lush, creamy stuff you might imagine. Most monasteries produce two tiers of cheese: soft, fresh cheeses for immediate consumption, and harder, aged ones for long-term storage or distribution during fasts and winter. The hard cheeses often needed soaking or grating just to become edible again, and yes, some of them doubled as projectiles during food fights. Unofficially, you take a seat and accept a rough clay cup filled with warm barley water. It tastes vaguely like wet hay and ambition, but it does the job. You nibble one of the cheese shards, salty, a little nutty, and surprisingly satisfying. Someone passes by with a basket of cabbages, another with a tray of damp cloths. A third is trying to explain something about the turnip seller to an older monk via a series of increasingly elaborate hand gestures. You catch the sign for exploding and decide it's probably best to move on. You exit through a side door and emerge into the herb garden, your boots brushing against low sprigs of thyme, sage, and marjoram. The scent is immediate and vivid, earthy, calming, and complex. You pause to admire the neat rows of green, bordered by flat stones and small wooden signs, some of which are helpfully labeled in Latin and others that appear to have been pecked by birds into illegibility. Beneath one overgrown hedge, you spot something hidden, a small wooden box, propped open with a twig. Inside, wrapped cheeses, clearly set aside for someone. A small wax seal on the cloth bears the initials FM. Brother Flavin, maybe. He always did have a taste for the good stuff. Quirky tidbit? Monastic records mention secret stashes of cheese hidden during Lent by particularly food-motivated monks. Technically, most forms of cheese were forbidden during the strictest fasts. Anything derived from animal fat was suspect. But rules, as any monk with a decent cheese knife will tell you, can be interpreted creatively. For medicinal use was a particularly popular loophole. You wander to the edge of the herb beds, where an old trellis leans drunkenly under the weight of dormant grapevines. At its base, 3 elderly hens strut, pecking at invisible bugs and clucking to themselves with the self-importance of minor nobility. One of them wears a bit of red ribbon around her leg, a sign, perhaps that she lays the best eggs, or simply lost a bet. You find a low wall and sit again, pocketing a crumbling wedge of cheese that you honestly suspect might be older than the abbot. As you chew slowly, a breeze stirs the tall cypress trees beyond the garden. Their branches sway in solemn agreement with some silent vow, and the late sun cuts long shadows across the grass. Historians still argue whether monastic kitchens operated more like communal canteens or like low-key culinary laboratories. Some scholars claim each kitchen followed strict dietary schedules from a central rulebook. Others point to regional variations, personality clashes between cooks, and the fact that monks were often gifted strange ingredients from wealthy patrons. One such gift? A wheel of cheese so massive it took 3 carts to deliver and had to be stored in the chapter house because it wouldn't fit anywhere else. You finish the last of your cheese and rise, brushing crumbs from your robes. As you turn, you nearly trip over a young novice who's crouched behind the rosemary, clearly trying to sneak a bite of something. He glances up, frozen mid-crumble, mouthful of guilt and dairy. You nod solemnly. He swallows quickly and bolts toward the laundry with impressive speed. You stretch your legs and make your way toward the cloister walk again, the familiar arches casting calming shadows across the flagstones. From one corner comes the faint thrum of a chant rehearsal, somewhere between in tune and divine. You pause at the fountain in the center of the square, its stone basin green with age and mossy wisdom. A jug rests beside it, likely cooling before dinner, and beside the jug, like an offering, sits a wrapped cheese wheel, delicately balanced on a slate board. A note is tucked beneath it, for Brother Marcus. Do not touch. This means you, Anselm. You chuckle softly. The war over personal. Cheese rations is eternal dot, and then it hits you, that soft, rich scent of warm cheese carried on the wind from the main kitchen. Supper must be close. You feel it in your bones. Or at least in your stomach, which begins composing a short opera titled Ode to Melted Dairy. You rise again, fully prepared to follow that smell like a sleepy bloodhound with holy ambitions. But for now, you pause beneath the arches, letting the evening light touch your face, the last crumbs of ancient cheese on your fingertips, and the undeniable sense that even in silence, this place is always murmuring one thing: cheese. Always. Cheese. You walk back beneath the archways of the cloister, the last golden streaks of sunlight clinging to the upper stonework like melted wax on a candle stub. The chant rehearsal in the distance fades into softer humming now, like the walls themselves are exhaling the day. Somewhere to your left, a wooden door creaks slowly, thoughtfully followed by a distinct thump, and what can only be described as a monk loudly apologizing to a wheelbarrow. You pause again, because something has changed. The scent in the air has shifted, less of burning barley and more of toasted crust, warm milk, and a whisper of something sharp and sweet. The supper bell hasn't rung yet, but you, a seasoned student of ecclesiastical dairy, know what this means. Cheese-making is happening. You follow your nose past the laundry green and into a courtyard that feels a bit more utilitarian, less ornamental gravel, more muddy footprints and overturned pails. Here, the monastery's smaller working spaces are tucked behind thick wooden doors, each one labeled in Latin or plain carved icons. And there, just past the drying racks and rain barrels, is the door you're looking for, painted with a curling script and a small wheel of cheese with a halo. You knock gently and push. The scent greets you like a kindly but overwhelmed aunt, warm, busy, and slightly frantic. Inside, a single oil lamp flickers beside a long wooden table where 2 monks in rolled-up sleeves are slowly stirring a large copper vat with paddles as tall as themselves. Steam rises like the breath of the cheese itself. A nearby shelf holds molds, muslin cloths, bowls of herbs, and one suspiciously ornate grater that looks like it moonlights as a weapon. Mainstream fact: many monasteries during the High and Late Middle Ages ran their own full-scale dairies. with dedicated monks or lay brothers tasked with producing specific cheeses for internal use, trade, or storage. Cheese-making was both a spiritual duty and a serious business. The methods varied, of course, but most followed established seasonal rhythms: spring for fresh curds, late summer for aging, and winter for brining, and hoped that you step closer, careful not to disrupt the delicate balance of motion. One of the monks is singing under his breath, a slow, steady drone that matches the circular stirring of the curdling milk. You recognize the melody from a Vesper hymn. Either that, or it's his way of counting stirs. After all, monastic cheese-making sometimes required precise sequences. Stir 77 times clockwise, pause for prayer, then stir 33 times widdershins, while meditating on humility and drainage. On a bench by the wall rests a long row of cheeses in various stages of life. Some are still soft and jiggly in their molds. Others are hardening with pale crusts. One or two wear thin white coats of mold like venerable elders. Each is labeled with a date, a saint's name, and sometimes a tiny drawing: a sheep, a moon, a loaf of bread. You suspect Brother Martin is behind those. Quirky tidbit? Some monastic cheeses were blessed during production. Not formally. Mind you, there's no official rite for invoking divine aging, but it was common for cheesemakers to say prayers during each stage. The most pious even kept a candle burning by the brining tubs in case the Lord needed to inspect the salt levels. You crouch beside a low stool, where an apprentice is gently flipping a round of cheese the size of a small footstool. He grunts slightly with effort, then beams with pride as the cheese lands cleanly on its other side. The monk beside him pats his back with approval and promptly hands him another wheel. Monastic encouragement is equal parts spiritual and physical. Labor, historians still argue whether cheese-making monks were held in higher regard than their gardening or brewing counterparts. Some abbeys gave cheese monks special privileges, a slightly larger dinner portion, or first pick at the spring laundry rota. Others viewed them as glorified kitchen hands. But in any case, the reputation of a monastery's cheese often shaped its external relationships. A good cheese could open diplomatic doors. A bad one, well, that's what penance is for. A nearby shelf holds the tools of the trade: ladles carved from ashwood, linen drying cloths, a hefty press for compacting curds, and a slightly battered book with splashes of whey along its edges. It's open to a page labeled Caseus Firmus Firm Cheese. The notes are half in Latin, half in shorthand, and several entries end with alarming phrases like, "If bubbling continues after prayer, discard." In the back corner of the room stands a larder cupboard, its doors slightly ajar. Inside rest the aged wheels, some marked with wax, others wrapped in bark, a few bandaged with cloth. These are the prized ones, the cheeses of ceremony or winter stores. One has a gold ribbon around it and a little tag: "For bishop's visit, do not sample." Brother G. You resist the urge that someone taps your shoulder. It's Brother Oswald, a round man with a grin that suggests he's already sampled most of the cheeses here. He offers you a sliver of something pale yellow and crumbly. You accept. It tastes like toasted oats and morning light. He nods in approval, then wipes his knife on a cloth that might once have been part of a curtain, and just like that, supper's close. The bell rings in the distance, a soft, slow chime that resonates like warm broth down the spine. The monks begin tidying their tools, muttering brief prayers of thanks, and covering the still-curing wheels with muslin blankets. One of them, perhaps mischievously, tucks a tiny wedge of cheese into his robe's pocket before blowing out the fa divin et du monde lamp. You follow the others into the corridor, footsteps echoing against the flagstones as the scent of food grows stronger. Deeper cheese, bread, cabbage stew, and the gentle warmth of roasted apples. You know the supper hall will be quiet, the benches wooden and slightly splintery, the candles stubby but sufficient. And yet, despite the simplicity, maybe because of it, there's something sacred about this cheese-infused pilgrimage. From field to vat, from prayer to plate, the monastic wheel keeps turning. As do the cheese wheels. You shuffle into the refectory with the rest of the monks, a quiet river of wool and linen robes swishing softly against stone. The long benches gleam faintly in the candlelight, freshly scrubbed after midday meals and now prepared for evening sustenance. The smells drifting in from the kitchen have grown bolder: roasted roots, softened onions, coarse bread still steaming from the oven. But you can sense the presence of cheese even before you see it. It's there in the faint tang on the air, the slow, mellow hum of warmth that speaks of something aged, tempered, and sliced just right. You take your seat on the far left near a cracked window with a view of the herb garden. Outside, the mist still curls low around the basil and the thyme. Inside, bowls and platters begin to appear, passed down with reverent efficiency. No one talks, not yet. Supper in many monasteries was traditionally taken in silence, punctuated only by the scrape of spoon against bowl and the voice of the designated reader, perched on a small pulpit at the room center. Tonight's reading is from Gregory the Great, or at least that's what it starts as. But halfway through a particularly dense passage on humility, the monk reading pauses, squints at the parchment, and mutters, "Oh dear." Everyone freezes for a heartbeat. Then, without missing another beat, he clears his throat and begins again, this time with a parable involving a chicken, a cartwheel, and somehow eternal grace. You suspect Brother Elias copied the wrong scroll again. A soft titter runs through the room before the solemnity resets. Spoons clink. Bread is torn. And you, like the others, reach for your modest clay plate, where a familiar wedge now rests, a semi-hard cheese, streaked faintly with blue-green veins, gently sweating under the warmth of the hall. It smells faintly of mushrooms, clean straw, and what you'd imagine a blessed thunderstorm might taste like. Mainstream historical fact: cheese was a staple in monastic diets, not just for pleasure or preservation, but for nutrition and theological practicality. Monks often abstained from meat for extended periods, especially during fasts, feast eves, and Lent. Cheese along with eggs and fish was considered an acceptable protein alternative. As a result, it wasn't just a treat. It was spiritual. Sustenance. You spread a bit of cheese on a heel of rye bread, chewing slowly. It's creamy but pungent, with a bite that makes your eyes widen for a moment. Across the table, Brother Andrew gives a slow, appreciative nod, which in monastic terms is equal to a standing ovation. You make a note to ask later what it was, perhaps St. Hildegard's winter curd or the rarely served but memorable midnight wheel, aged for 9 months in an unused wine cask. The room is quiet save for chewing, page turning, and the occasional sigh of satisfaction. You spot one monk gently nudging a tiny pot of plum preserves toward his neighbor, a secret act of charity disguised as condiment placement. Another carefully scrapes the rind off his cheese and tucks it into his robe, likely for later reflection. Or possibly a pet mouse. Quirky tidbit? Some monastic communities practiced what's known as cheese almsgiving. If there was surplus after meals or cheeses deemed too strong for the brethren, they'd be donated to the poor, to travelers, or even traded with nearby abbeys. In particularly zealous households, the act of giving away cheese was considered a form of spiritual generosity. A dairy tithe, if you will. You lean back slightly, letting the heat of the meal settle into your bones. The reader's voice now lulls into something even the parchment seems to forget halfway through. It's not unpleasant, just long-winded. In the ecclesiastical tradition of, if I stop reading, the world might end. You glance around. Several monks have adopted the posture of deep prayer, which conveniently involves closed eyes and subtle chewing. One is almost certainly asleep, mouth still open and clutching his spoon like a relic. Historians still argue whether monastic mealtimes were truly silent or simply structured to prevent unnecessary chatter. Some accounts describe entire meals spent in complete quiet. Others mention whispered blessings, coded glances, or silent gesturing to request more bread without invoking divine wrath. Still others claim that the most devout simply learn to speak in cheese-offering wedges as commentary and curds as consolation. You finish the last of your plate, wiping up crumbs with a crust that's harder than your boots. The cheese lingers on your tongue, rich and assertive. Behind you, someone clears their throat in that unmistakable end-of-meal fashion. The reader's voice rises to a conclusion involving a fig tree, a hermit, and the dangers of overconfidence, then abruptly stops. A bell rings once. Time for grace. All heads bow. A single voice offers thanks, simple, brief, and grateful. Then, the scraping of benches begins as monks rise, some returning plates to the kitchens, others disappearing back into the maze of passageways. You linger a moment, watching a trail of crumbs that leads toward the hallway like tiny edible footprints. Your satchel is slumped near the door, still damp and sulking. You retrieve it, feeling its familiar weight settle against your shoulder. Somewhere inside, cheese still hums, curing, aging, waiting. But for now, supper has ended and night is calling. You step back outside. The mist has thickened again, rising from the earth like the land is exhaling into the dark. One by one, candles blink out in the cloister windows, and the smell of cheese, faint and sacred, follows you into the quiet hush of evening. The mist curls around your ankles like an indecisive cat as you tread softly down the cloister's outer path. Behind you, the last of the supper plates clatter into a tin wash basin, and the warm aromas of roasted barley and melting cheese are swept away by a cool evening breeze. Your boots, still slightly damp, scuff the stone rhythmically. You could almost mistake the monastery for a ship afloat in a sea of clouds, its stone arches rising like sails, its chapel spire pointing upward like a mast to heaven. Inside your satchel still damp, still obstinate, a particular cheese continues to travel with you. It's not just any cheese, but a wrapped wedge of St. Maldwin's Quiet, so named for the peculiar hush it seemed to inspire in anyone who ate it. It's sharp, chalky, and prone to crumbling like the convictions of a tired theologian, but tonight it has purpose. You're meant to deliver it to the infirmary. The monastery's infirmary lies tucked behind a narrow, vine-covered corridor, and you tread there now. The garden you pass is unusually lively for the hour-silent flowers blooming in the moonlight. A hedgehog snuffling under a cabbage, and a fat moth attempting to romance a candle in vain. You nod politely, because in a place like this, even the insects might be novice monks. Inside the infirmary, the air shifts. It smells of vinegar, beeswax, rosemary, and a hint of boiled wool. Shelves sag beneath ceramic jars marked with elegant Latin names: Tinctura lavandulae, Aqua rosé, Vinum ferium. And somewhere amid the balms and tinctures, cheese. Not for treating wounds directly, of course, but as a crucial part of convalescence. A monk recovering from a fever might be given thin broth and a sliver of soft cheese to entice the appetite. For the elderly, a gentle goat's milk curd, easy to digest and served with poached apples. You place the wedge on a linen-lined shelf, next to a loaf of dark bread and a dried sprig of lemon balm. Mainstream historical fact: infirmaries within medieval monasteries operated with remarkable autonomy and care. Monks served as herbalists, physicians and caregivers, maintaining detailed records and devising treatments from plants, minerals, and sometimes food. Cheese, particularly soft, fresh varieties, was used as a nourishing agent, much like modern hospitals serve toast and soup. The brother in charge of the infirmary, a stooped man with spectacles so thick they could probably focus moonlight, ambles over. He inspects your offering with the same reverence one might afford a sacred relic. "Ah," he murmurs. "Just the thing. He's been refusing gruel." He jerks his head toward a curtained alcove. You offer a small nod and retreat, letting the healer do his work. Outside once more, the night is deepening. Stars poke through the thinning clouds like shy lanterns, and a hush settles over the monastery so complete, you swear you can hear the wood creaking in the rafters above. As you walk, you begin to think oddly about rules. Not just the rules of silence or humility, but of cheese itself. Who gets to make it? Who decides when it's ready? And more importantly, what happens when monks disagree? Quirky tidbit? In the 13th century, an abbey in France recorded a multi-day theological dispute over whether a newly invented cheese made with sheep's milk and rolled in crushed herbs counted as a modification of divine intent. The argument stalled chapter meetings for over a week. Eventually, they settled the matter the medieval way, by letting the abbot taste it and declare it worthy. You follow the cloister walls, your fingers brushing old limestone. The monastery, after all, is older than most kings. Its walls have seen invaders, plagues, royal messengers, and at least one very determined goose. They've also witnessed centuries of cheese-making rituals. You recall one of your first weeks here, watching a novice attempt to flip a cheese wheel in the cellar. It slipped. The poor boy dove after it with such theatricality that it ricocheted off 3 shelves and landed squarely in a pail of metal beer. You're fairly certain the wheel was later served at a feast and described as refreshingly zesty. Historians still argue whether monasteries pioneered true cheese aging or simply discovered it by accident when someone forgot a wheel in a damp corner. Records are unclear. Some attribute early rind formation to controlled experimentation, others to divine clumsiness. Either way, monastic cheese cellars evolved into masterpieces of climate control, thick-walled, partially underground, and occasionally blessed for good measure. You duck into one such cellar now, using a hidden stair that leads beneath the east transept. The air turns cooler, denser. It smells faintly of old milk, oak planks, and yes, patience. Wheels and rounds lie stacked like ancient coins, each marked in chalk with initials and dates. Some have matured for months, a few for years. You pull out a small lamp and walk slowly, scanning the chalk markings. You pass a golden rind of summer, fennel, an oozing blue-veined behemoth known as Brother Lawrence's Regret, and a slender cylinder with a note that reads simply, "Do not move, alive." Far in the back, you find your goal, a tiny wrapped parcel tucked beside a crock of pickled onions. It's destined for the chapel vestry to be served after tomorrow's high mass, along with honeyed oat cakes and preserved gooseberries. Cradle the cheese, still cold from the stone floor, and return upstairs. Your final task of the evening is a quiet one. You step into the empty chapel, its high arches lost in shadow. A few candles remain, casting long, dreamy light over the carved pews and the altar draped in deep blue cloth. You walk softly, placing the wrapped cheese beside a covered basket of fruit. There's something solemn about cheese in a chapel. It's simple, honest, more spiritual than you expected. You pause, then gently cross yourself, not out of obligation, but out of appreciation for the cow, the curd, and the quiet dot. As you step back into the cloister, the wind hums low, and your satchel is blessedly light. The night has claimed the monastery in full now. The cheese is resting. So perhaps should you. The moon rides high now, a pale coin in a velvet sky, casting its light like a blessing over the tiled rooftops and quiet gardens of the monastery. You pause just past the chapel steps, the ancient stones cold beneath your solace even through your boots, and feel for the first time today's stillness. It doesn't last, of course. Stillness is never truly still when you live in a place where even the wind has duties. A bell tolls in the distance, not from your own monastery, but perhaps from St. Bracken's over the hill. You count the chimes. 8. Night prayers have ended. Most of the monks are tucked away in their cells by now, each with a candle guttering low and dreams full of psalms and possibly better cheese. You, however, are not quite done. Your path takes you along the outer cloister and back toward the scriptorium, because tonight a scroll awaits. A scroll and a record. You've been asked to deliver a parcel not to a person, but to the library itself. The scriptorium is one of the oldest parts of the abbey. Its door creaks like a tired canter, and the floorboards are polished smooth by centuries of sandals. Inside, the air is dry and faintly musty, with undertones of ink, wax, and quiet ambition. This is the domain of scribes and scholars, men who spent their days translating, illuminating, and yes, occasionally doodling grumpy faces in the margins of sacred texts. Mainstream historical fact: monastic scriptoria were vital centers of learning in the Middle Ages and Georgian era alike, preserving texts through painstaking copying. While printing presses were long established by now, some remote monasteries still relied on hand-illustrated manuscripts, particularly for ceremonial use or local chronicles. You tread softly past a row of desks, each neatly arranged with quills, sand trays for blotting, and little stones used to hold open parchment. At the far end, you see Brother Lucien, hunched and lamplit, carefully lettering the heading of a vellum-bound register. Durie Cassis, of cheese. Yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. Brother Lucien glances up, his eyes bleary behind round spectacles. "Ah," he says, "you've brought it." You hand him a small wooden box, sealed with wax and smelling faintly of thyme and toasted hazelnuts. He opens it reverently to reveal slices of a pale, semi-hard cheese layered with dried fig. "We've agreed this one is to be recorded," he says, and with a surprisingly spry motion for a man who spends 14 hours a day writing, he dips his quill. Quirky tidbit: some monasteries actually kept detailed cheese logs, not just for inventory, but to track flavors, textures, and the names of the brothers involved in production. A particularly well-liked wheel might be granted a name, commemorated in a meal, or gifted to a visiting bishop. Less successful batches were discreetly relabeled for pilgrims. You watch as Lucien records the cheese's traits: smoothness, aroma, degree of crumb. He notes its likely pairings: hazelnut biscuits, mulled cider, and late evening readings from St. Bernard. Then, gently, he places a thin slice on a scrap of parchment and offers it to you. You chew slowly. The fig surprises you first, sweet and chewy, then the cheese follows, nutty and slightly sharp, with a creamy afterthought. You nod. "This one will make the winter bearable," Lucien chuckles. "That is the hope." As you leave, you glance once more at the scriptorium's shelves, rows of bound parchment, each heavy with the weight of knowledge and monks' very careful handwriting. Somewhere among them are sermons, herbal remedies, and now an ode to cheese. Historians still argue whether monks ever exaggerated their food descriptions in these texts. Some recipes are suspiciously poetic, bordering on culinary fan fiction. One account from a Wiltshire abbey describes a cheese so fragrant it called forth the memory of divine summer and silenced the bees. Your path leads back out into the open cloister, where ivy dances lazily on the walls and shadows gather like old friends. You head for the garden, your last errand before sleep. In your satchel, Nestled among wrappers and parchment scraps is a tiny parcel of rennet, dried and packed in muslin. The brothers in charge of the dairy asked for it this morning, and now it must be buried. Buried? Yes. Well, sort of. You arrive at the herb garden where rosemary and sage flank a small compost heap. Nearby, you spot the low wooden box used for curing rennet and other delicate dairy tools. You open it, place the packet gently inside, and cover it with cloth and straw. It's a quiet ritual, but one the monks take seriously. Rennet, an essential in cheese making, has long been derived from the stomach lining of calves. But in monasteries where resources were limited or vegetarian ideals held sway, alternate methods were developed: fig sap, nettles, or even thistles. This packet, thistle-based, kind to cows and surprisingly effective. The stars above wheel slowly as you stand in the garden. The scent of mint and damp earth rises, mingling with the ever-present aroma of cheese, faint but constant. Like the monastery's breath, you head back toward your cell, past the silent well and the armory-turned-granary. The night is deep now, ink-dark and vast. And as you walk, your thoughts wander, back to the dairy, to Brother Lucian's ink-stained hands, to the faint sweetness of figs and the sharpness of cheese, and to the idea unspoken, but true, that perhaps all this effort isn't just about food. Perhaps it's about continuity, about ritual, about holding something in your hands, a wheel, a letter, a moment in saying, "This mattered." Your door creaks as you open it. The lamp flickers once, then settles. You sit down slowly, remove your boots, and unwrap the last wedge from your satchel. You cut off a corner with your pocket knife and pop it into your mouth. It's sharp, a little crumbly, possibly older than it should be. Perfect. Your cell is small, humble, and perfectly functional, like everything else in the monastery that hasn't been accidentally set on fire by overly enthusiastic candlelight or overly bored novices. The walls are whitewashed, the floor is flagstone, and your bed is really more of a wooden shelf with a mattress thin enough to double as a folded blanket in a less ambitious household. But it's yours. And for now, that's enough. You sit on the edge of your bunk, slowly removing your stockings. The one on the left has a hole the size of a hazelnut. You wiggle your toes through it. It's the closest thing to entertainment you'll allow yourself before sleep. Well, that and one final bite of cheese. Tonight's selection? A crumbly wedge of pale yellow made 2 weeks ago in the southern cellar. It was part of an experimental batchless salt, more time. The results have been polarizing. Brother Eldrick said it tastes like remorse. You disagree. You think it tastes like late summer and sheep who didn't quite stay on the path. You lean back against the wall, chewing slowly, staring up at the exposed beam running across your ceiling. The wood is ancient. There's a knot in it shaped like a bear, if you squint, or perhaps a very concerned monk. Hard to say. This is the hour when the abbey breathes. Everything slows. The bells are quiet, the wind curls softly around corners, and the mice in the pantry plot their crimes in relative peace. You close your eyes for a moment and try to remember the cheese roster for tomorrow. Yes, Brother Matthew is due to flip the wheels in the south corridor, and Brother Dominic is in charge of the excess mold experiment, which may or may not be sanctioned. Mainstream historical fact. Mold-ripened cheeses like brie and camembert owe their distinctive flavors to the careful cultivation of beneficial mold, something that medieval monks pioneered through trial, error, and the occasional mistake that turned delicious. These aging methods would eventually influence modern European cheese standards centuries later. Your thoughts drift to Brother Dominic, who once tried to age cheese by burying it in a sack of barley for enhanced terroir. The result smelled like old porridge and ambition. No one's asked him to experiment since, but you secretly admire the effort. You reach for your notebook, which lies beside a stub of candle. Not for writing letters, those are discouraged after Compline, but for jotting down cheese notes. Every monk has their own system. Some draw wheels, others use numbers. You use metaphor, tonight's cheese? You write, sharp as a bishop's glare, hints of regret. Good with apples. You blow out the candle and let the darkness settle. But sleep, of course, does not come easily. Not in a monastery. Because just as you begin to slip into dreams of melting wheels and overflowing cellars, the bell rings again. Matins. Again. You groan silently, swing your legs over the edge of the bed, and grope around for your robe. It's still damp from the drizzle earlier, and now smells faintly of both wax and stale turnip soup. You throw it over your shoulders anyway and shuffle toward the chapel like a man being summoned to his own cheese tribunal. Outside, the night air is cold and sharp. Stars glitter above in defiance of the cloud cover, and your breath puffs like incense. You pass another monk in the corridor, Brother Silas, eyes half closed, clutching a lantern and mumbling what may be scripture or a complaint about his knees. The chapel glows faintly ahead. As you enter, you bow your head, partly in reverence, partly to hide the yawn you can't quite suppress. The choir stalls are half filled already. Some monks are kneeling. Others sway gently in the kind of microdoze only years of habit can achieve. The abbot stands at the lectern. He begins with a psalm, something about enduring hardship with grace. You nod along, as if you weren't currently wearing damp socks and thinking longingly of cheese. You kneel, you mutter, you do your part. But even as the prayers rise around you, your mind drifts back to the cellar, to the wheels resting silently in straw-lined cradles. The ones aged for months, flipped weekly, brushed with salt water. The ones that hum with patience and promise? Quirky tidbit? Some monasteries developed elaborate aging schedules where cheeses were assigned not just names and weights, but personality traits. There are records of wheels being blessed before long aging periods, or even being sung to either for flavor or for morale. Historians still argue whether these practices were spiritual devotion or early marketing strategy. Did blessing a cheese make it taste better? Or was it simply a way to pass the time during a long, damp winter? You'd like to think it's both. After all, if monks can argue over the proper Latin for curd, they can certainly debate the theology of a cheese chant. The final prayer ends, and the monks file out slowly. Some look serene. Others look like they've just wrestled an angel. You walk back to your cell, robe brushing against stone, steps echoing in the silence. Somewhere a distant owl hoots, or possibly laughs. Inside your room again, you collapse into bed with a grunt. The mattress doesn't protest. It gave up years ago. You pull your blanket up to your chin, tuck your feet under the warmer stone corner, and finally let your mind sink into dreams. Tonight, you dream of wheels the size of carts, of cheeses crowned like kings, of little frogs that live in moldy rinds and sing lullabies in Latin. Don't question it. Just sleep. The dreams stay with you longer than they should. You wake not to bells, but to the soft rustle of someone passing by your door, a shuffle of sandals, the whisper of linen robes brushing old stone. The morning has arrived unnoticed, slipping through cracks in the shutters and pooling faint light along your wall. A new day, a new round of tasks, a new wedge of something pungent and possibly still evolving. You stretch beneath your threadbare blanket, feeling the stiffness in your joints and the slight ache in your lower back, souvenirs from yesterday's cheese-turning rotation. The older wheels are heavier than they look and more stubborn too, like oxen made of milk and salt. Rising is a slow process. You sit upright, Pull on your britches with the resignation of a man who knows they'll never quite dry out properly, and lace your boots without urgency. The cheese isn't going anywhere, unless the cellar floods again, which it sometimes does. You step outside your cell into the corridor. The air smells faintly of candle smoke, damp stone, and the trailing edge of someone's morning porridge. You follow the sun toward the cloister walk, where morning light spills through arched windows and paints the flagstones in pale gold. It would be beautiful if not for the chill that wraps around your ankles like a judgmental ghost. You're on your way to the scriptorium, but first you pass the refectory, where a table near the entrance has been laid with a standard monastic. Breakfast, oat porridge, a hunk of dark bread, and of course a small slice of last week's soft cheese. Set out with casual reverence, you pause, eyeing the cheese. It's slightly weepy at the edges. A good sign. You pick it up gently with your fingers, sniff it, and mutter, "You've improved." Because yes, this is the kind of place where you talk to your cheese. Mainstream historical fact. Monks were responsible for developing and standardizing cheese-making techniques that are still used today, particularly in relation to timing, temperature, control, and the specific uses of rennet. Their meticulous record-keeping made them unlikely but effective dairy scientists. As you chew the morning offering mild, tangy, with a whisper of something green, you continue toward the scriptorium. You're not a scribe yourself, not officially, but you're occasionally called upon to inventory the marginalia. Some monks, particularly Brother Isidore, have a tendency to doodle things that are not exactly devotional. Last week you found a hedgehog jousting with a beetroot. You arrive, push open the heavy door, and inhale the smell of parchment, ink, beeswax polish, and ambition. The room is full of light and silence, except for the scratching of quills and the occasional muffled sneeze. Brother Theobald, head scribe, nods without looking up. "South shelf," he mutters. "New illuminations need checking." You walk along rows of desks and quiet monks bent over vellum. At the far end, you find a stack 6 folios, carefully laid out on a cloth runner, each one bearing delicate gold leaf details and meticulously painted saints. And in one margin, a very realistic depiction of what appears to be a cheese. Wheel mid-dash explosion. You make a note. Brother Isidore again. As you work, your thoughts drift back to the cheese-making chamber, also known informally as the cave, even though it's not a cave. Just a very damp room with bad lighting and worse ventilation. You remember how yesterday, the elder brother Lucien brought in a bucket of washed curds and asked you to whisper sweet nothings to them. You thought he was joking. He was not. He believes curds respond better to kindness than to stirring. Quirky tidbit? In some monastic traditions, novices were taught to sing or hum to their curds while stirring, believing the vibrations helped maintain a harmonious texture. There's no scientific proof it worked, but some cheeses did turn out suspiciously mellow. Historians still argue whether these practices were rooted in ancient agricultural beliefs, early sound therapy, or simply a strategy to keep bored monks occupied during long stirs. Whatever the case, the cheese room echoes with soft humming more often than not. You finish your scriptorium duties and slip away before Brother Theobald can assign you calligraphy drills. Your fingers are more suited for flipping wheels than forming. Elegant serifs. Back outside, the day has fully arrived. Birds chatter in the ivy, bees fumble around the herb garden, and somewhere nearby, someone drops a bucket and yells about their toe. All is well in the world. You make your way to the cheese room, the stone corridor darkening as you descend. The door is thick and swollen with age. You push it open and inhale. Aromas you can't quite name fill your nose. Damp straw, bruised thyme, overripe milk, a hint of mushroom, and something that smells a bit like regret. The walls are lined with wooden shelves, and each one holds wheels at different stages of becoming. Some are new soft, pale, and nervous. Others are old and cracking. Their rinds bloomed with white or gray, like wise elders wrapped in cloaks. Of mildew. You walk slowly through the rows, checking notes, flipping a few wheels with your practiced hands, knocking on others like fruit in a market stall. Each one responds with a different thud. It's music, in its own way. In the far corner, Brother Lucien is attempting to apply ash to a round of goat's milk cheese, mumbling what may be a blessing or a recipe under his breath. You nod at him. He nods back, eyes bright behind round spectacles. Today, he says quietly, we try fennel. You whisper, bold choice. You crouch beside the aging shelf, brush back a layer of straw, and inspect one of your own projects. A stout, stinky fellow you've named Wilfred. He's ripening nicely, with a smell that could clear a chapter meeting. You gently poke his rind. Just the right amount of give. This is progress. You stand again and return to the door, pausing once. More to take it all in. The chill, the scent, the silent patience of 100 tiny miracles happening all at once. Tucked beneath wax and rind. Outside, the bell rings again. Time for midday prayer. You sigh. You were just starting to relax. The bell's echo rolls across the cloister like a sleepy reminder that you are, above all else, part of a schedule. A liturgical heartbeat. A slow but insistent drum that keeps monastic life in order. Lauds, prime, terce, sext, and so on, like solemn punctuation in your day. It doesn't matter if you're elbow deep in curds or halfway through naming a cheese wheel after your childhood dog. When the bell rings, you go. You make your way up the dim corridor, brushing bits of straw from your habit, already mentally composing a silent apology to Brother Aldrich for smelling faintly of brine. Again. Sex prayers are usually brief, quiet. Gathering in the chapel with psalms, a reading, and just enough time to dry out your socks beneath the wooden pew. You slide into your usual spot, bow your head, and let the familiar cadence wash over you. The monk leading the reading has a voice like warm broth, and by the time the third psalm begins, your stomach starts to rumble. Right on cue, because after sex comes lunch. And if there's one thing that keeps you and most of the brethren from floating off into ecstatic detachment, it's the hope of what might appear on the refectory table. Mainstream historical fact. In many medieval monasteries, meals were modest but surprisingly consistent. The rule of Saint Benedict prescribed 2 meals a day, often featuring vegetables, bread, legumes, and yes, a measured portion of cheese. Meat was reserved for the ill or elderly, though some monks developed creative ways of classifying animals, like labeling beavers as fish to justify eating them during Lent. Today's lunch? Stewed lentils, a slab of coarse rye bread, a turnip that looks suspiciously like the one you passed in the garden 3 days ago, and a modest helping of crumbly white cheese with a rind the color of sand. You sit beside Brother Milo, a man who can identify any cheese by smell alone and who insists on narrating his lunch as if reviewing a performance. This one, he murmurs, cutting a piece and holding it to the light, has ambition, but it's afraid of commitment. You nod solemnly, as if this makes sense. It kind of does. The cheese is sharp, almost lemony, with a faint herbal undertone. Sage, maybe? Or was that just from the cutting board? You don't ask. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, especially when it involves a monastery kitchen. Across the table, Brother Raymond has arranged his food into a miniature fortress. The cheese forms the outer wall. The turnip is clearly a siege tower. You've learned not to question it. Conversation as sparse meals are often taken in relative silence, save for a designated reader at the front who recites from a book of saints' lives or instructional texts. Today's passage is about St. Ulrich, who apparently once exorcised a cursed wheel of cheese by blessing it and flinging it into a river. You chew thoughtfully, eyes drifting to your own plate. You make a mental note to ask Brother Lucien about aquatic purification methods later. Quirky tidbit. Some medieval communities did, in fact, bless cheese, milk, and other dairy products during religious festivals, particularly at Pentecost or harvest feasts. There are even records of specially consecrated cheeses being used to cure illnesses or protect homes from storms. The logic was simple. If bread could be holy, why not cheese? After lunch, the refectory empties out in quiet waves. You linger. A little longer to finish your bread, then pocket the last crumb of cheese for later. For the dog behind the gatehouse. Or for yourself, depending on how the afternoon goes. Back outside, the sun peeks through a thinning veil of clouds, offering a warmth so brief and delicate it feels almost rude. You squint, breathe in the mossy sunlit air, and trudge back toward the workyards. Today's task is less glamorous than aging cheese, it's soap boiling. You've been volunteered, perhaps. As penance for that time you oversalted the brine vat. Soap boiling involves rendering fat, mixing in ashes, and trying not to pass out from the fumes. You stir the pot slowly, eyes watering, nose burning, wondering once again why Brother Edmund insists this is good for the soul. A few steps away, an argument breaks out over whether last month's soap batch ruined the laundry or if the laundry ruined the soap. You try not to inhale too deeply. Historians still argue whether monks truly enjoyed these tasks or simply endured them with religious resignation. Some records suggest a kind of competitive zeal among certain brothers attempting to out-ferment, out-render, or out-pickled one another in the name of divine perfection. Others point to the presence of detailed failure logs indicating not passion, but obligation. Eventually, the vat reaches a gentle simmer, the lye and tallow blending into a thick, beige substance that smells like justice and animal fat. You scrape the sides, stir again, and glance at the lengthening shadows. Time for inspection. Brother Lucien appears as if summoned, lifting the ladle and sniffing thoughtfully. A bit strong, he mutters, but passable. Like a sermon with too much Latin. You accept the compliment. Sort of dot work concludes with a cleanup that somehow leaves you dirtier, and you find yourself once again trudging the path past the orchard and into the storerooms. Here, barrels line the walls, some marked with symbols, others with mysterious dates or illegible Latin. You've learned not to touch the ones labeled experimenta. You're here to retrieve a linen-wrapped parcel from the back shelf. Inside is a cheese you've been watching for weeks, a blue-veined, slightly sunken wheel that promises either greatness or gastrointestinal regret. You carry it carefully, like a relic, back toward the cheese room. The shadows are longer now. The day has turned golden at the edges. The abbey breathes slowly, like a great tired animal. And in your arms, nestled in linen, is your small moldy offering to the cause. You glance down. It has started to sweat slightly. That's either a good sign or a very bad one. You'll find out tomorrow. The next morning greets you with a chorus of doves nesting above the dormitory windows and a draft strong enough to convince your ankles that winter has arrived early. You blink at the ceiling beams, trying to remember if you dreamt about cheese again, or if it was that sermon about humility disguised as a warning against gluttony. Either way, you stretch, yawn, and pull your woolen robe tighter before slipping your feet into shoes that seem to have shrunk slightly overnight, probably the humidity. Or divine punishment for stealing that extra biscuit last week. By the time you shuffle into the yard, the light is soft, dusted in mist, and the familiar sense of earth, firewood, and faintly sour whey hang in the air. Your destination is once again the cheese storeroom, less out of duty today and more out of curiosity, like a monk-shaped mouse returning to admire its handiwork. You unlatch the wooden door, its iron hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the smell hits you like a parchment-wrapped embrace. Dense, nutty, fungal. Like secrets you can eat. You exhale slowly, adjusting to the cool, slightly damp air. The wheel you brought in yesterday has been resting under linen, absorbing ambient moisture like a gluttonous sponge. You lift the cloth carefully and gaze upon its marbled surface. The blue veins have bloomed further overnight, threading through the ivory body like ancient ink across a scroll. You tilt it gently and tap the rind. It sounds hollow and slightly menacing. Perfect. Mainstream historical fact. Blue cheeses like Roquefort and Stilton owe their distinctive veining to molds such as Penicillium roqueforti, which develop in humid environments, often caves. Medieval monks were among the first to experiment with these mold ripening techniques, often by accident, when loaves of bread used to store or transport milk encouraged mold growth. Back in your small cheese lab, or Brother Petrok's curious corner of cultures and curds, as it's been unofficially dubbed, you prepare a wire slicer made from an old harp string donated, you suspect, after a particularly off-key Vespers session. With care bordering on reverence, you slice the wheel down the middle. The interior is a rich tapestry, cream-colored cheese riddled with bluish veins, softening slightly near the rind but firm toward the core. You break off a crumb and taste it. First comes the tang, sharp, assertive, the kind that startles the senses awake. Then the creaminess blooms, followed by an earthy bitterness and a final whisper of sweetness that vanishes like a monk at chore time. It's complex, bold, a little rude. Like Brother Milo's footnotes during silent reading. You jot down tasting notes in the communal cheese ledger. Under comments, you write, unapologetic, could stand up to pears, possibly the abbot. As you're tidying the tools, Brother Alaric pokes his head through the door. His beard is slightly askew, as if he lost a bet with his pillow. You've got visitors, he says, grinning. The chickens. Outside, a small crowd of hens has gathered near the shed, pecking at bits of grain and regarding you like an audience awaiting a lecture. One of them flaps dramatically and hops onto the stone ledge. You nod gravely. Every artisan must have critics. Quirky tidbit. Some monasteries kept highly trained animals not just for food or eggs, but for odd ceremonial or practical roles like geese that acted as living alarm systems or pigs that helped locate truffles in forested grounds. There's a record of a 13th century Cistercian abbey that held a mock trial for a chicken suspected of stealing sacramental bread. Spoiler: the chicken did not win. You wave the hens off with the authority of one who has learned the value of preserving rind integrity and make your way to the refectory. Today's task? Cheese presentation. You've been asked to assist in preparing a platter for visiting clerics, an event that combines the solemnity of liturgical service with the anxiety of amateur theater. You enter the kitchen where Brother Thomas, the monastery's unofficial culinary director and very official kitchen fire starter, is already organizing dishes. He hands you a wooden board. Use the hard cheeses at the corners. It implies stability. You nod, as if this is a commonly accepted aesthetic principle. Soon, you're assembling slices, wedges, and chunks like a jigsaw puzzle of divine dairy. Crumbly yellows near the sharp white. A thin wheel of goat's cheese rests atop a grape leaf. You add 2 fig halves, a sprinkle of herbs, and a final flourish of crushed walnut for texture. It is, in a word, majestic. Brother Thomas eyes it critically. Bit ostentatious. You point at the walnut. Symbolic, you say, mortality. He blinks, then nods. Historians still argue whether medieval monasteries emphasized food artistry or simply tolerated it when monks got bored. Some abbey records mentioned feast day arrangements featuring molded butter sculptures and cheese served in symbolic shapes, lambs, Stubbs or St. Bridget's Cross. Others suggest a more utilitarian approach focused on sustenance and frugality, with artistry sneaking in only through individual creativity. When the clerics arrive, the cheese board is placed reverently at the table center. There is a moment of polite nodding, some eyebrow raises, and the sound of hesitant cutlery. You retreat to the kitchen, but not before noticing one of the visitors, a stern-looking man in purple robes, take a second helping of the blue-veined cheese. You allow yourself a tiny, smug smile. Later, you sit by the fire, watching it crackle, your hands still smelling faintly of thyme and waxed paper. You sip warm cider from a chipped mug and feel the warmth seep into your bones. In your robe pocket, you still have the last sliver of the blue cheese wrapped in a bit of parchment, just for you. You nibble it slowly as the fire dims. Not a bad day. By the time twilight brushes across the cloister walls like the hand of a drowsy saint, you're back where you started, just with a fuller belly and considerably more opinions about curd structure. The sky overhead is streaked with pale lavender. And rust, the kind of sunset that looks like someone spilled elderberry ink on a psalter. You shuffle across the flagstones toward the west storeroom, a key swinging from your belt, the familiar creak of your boots announcing your approach like an accidental trumpet. It's quiet, almost reverent. Even the birds seem to have settled into their nightly routines, and the bees have retired from their investigations into the herb garden. Inside, it's cool, nearly silent, and smells richly of straw, old wood, and ripening cheese. You light a single beeswax candle and place it on the shelf, watching the glow ripple against wheels of hard-aged Goudas and squat cloth-bound cheddars. You're not here for work, not really, just checking in. Like one might with old friends, you pass a shelf of tiny goat cheeses wrapped in grape leaves, another of wax-sealed rounds painted with careful symbols, crosses, flowers, and one ambitious attempt at a cat's face that looks more like a regretful fish. You stop in front of your latest experiment, a semi-hard cow's milk aged in a walnut shell coating. You gently press your thumb to the rind. It gives just enough. Mainstream historical fact. Walnut leaves and husks were historically used as natural coatings for aging cheeses, helping preserve them while imparting a mild bitterness. Monks often experimented with local plants and coatings as natural preservatives, long before refrigeration was ever imagined. You make a note to try a sample tomorrow, then glance at a crate of crumbling white cheeses near the back, salt cured and potent enough to qualify as penance. These are your most ancient styles, inspired by Roman-era recipes that somehow survived Viking raids, the fall of several kingdoms, and Brother Milo's attempt at cleaning the shelves with vinegar. Quirky tidbit. One 12th century manuscript includes a recipe for a cheese made by pressing curds between two carved stones blessed by a bishop. The resulting cheese was said to prevent nightmares and, somewhat less impressively, prevent mice from entering cellars. You consider the implications, cheese as divine defense system, and decide it's probably safer than garlic garlands. You gently lift one wheel and sniff, salty, earthy, tangy, like someone distilled a thunderstorm through a sheep's wool sock and added herbs. The door creaks behind you. Brother Alaric. He nods at the candles. Wax from yesterday? Mixed with lavender, you reply, for atmospheric holiness. He chuckles, stepping inside. I figured I'd find you in here. You missed Complin's. You shrug sheepishly. I was communing with the rind. He doesn't press the issue. Instead, he pulls out a small paper-wrapped package. Brought something from the apothecary. Said it might help with that cough of yours. You hadn't realized you'd been coughing. But now that he says it, you take the parcel. Thank you. He wanders the shelves like a traveler in a sacred archive. Stops before the cloth-wrapped cheddars. This one's splitting, he observes. Humidity, you reply. I'll rewrap it with tighter linen tomorrow. Historians still argue whether monks kept formal aging records or relied purely on memory and observation. Some abbeys maintain detailed ledgers tracking milk origin, herb additions, temperature patterns. Others, especially smaller or poorer monasteries, used carved runes, notch marks on barrels, or the slightly less reliable Brother Cedric's nose test, which involved Cedric sniffing cheeses and making a face calibrated on a scale from delight to mild horror. You and Brother Alaric sit quietly for a moment, sharing the silence. Then he opens his satchel and pulls out a crusty heel of bread. You break off a wedge of the salty cheese. Together, you chew in thoughtful contemplation. The cheese burns slightly sharp, challenging, but the bread softens the edge. The candle flickers. So, Alaric says finally, are you going to enter the St. Bridget cheese contest next month? You? Snort. Absolutely not. You'd win. I disqualify myself halfway through trying to sculpt a Madonna out of butter, which would still be better than last year's entry. You both chuckle, remembering Brother Hugo's infamous Wheels of Fire cheese, which turned out to be a noble, if misguided, attempt at incorporating mustard seeds, horseradish, and a very confused chili pepper into one dairy product. The tasting panel had required 3 pitchers of cider and a bucket of snow dot outside. The wind picks up. You reach for another piece of cheese, something crumbly, golden, infused with rosemary, and chew slowly. There's a piece to this. Alaric says after a while, knowing something you made will rest for weeks, months, slowly becoming more than it was. You nod. It's patient work, and quiet. You think God likes cheese? You raise an eyebrow. You've seen the mold patterns on that blue rind from yesterday. Tell me that's not divine calligraphy. He grins, then rises. Come to bed. The cheeses won't judge you for needing sleep. You blow out the candle and follow him out. The door shuts with a side dot in your pocket. You carry a crumb of that. Walnut shell cheese. Nod because you're hungry. Just in case. In case of what? Well, you're not sure. But tomorrow's another day, and the rind always knows more than it says. Morning comes not with a trumpet blast, but with the faintest glimmer of light on stone and the soft chorus of drowsy doves in the eaves. You blink awake in your narrow cot, the wool blanket tangled around one ankle like it had ambitions of becoming a toga in the night. For a moment, you lie still, listening to the sound of the monastery stretching its limbs, distant footsteps, a cough from the corridor, the rhythmic scrape of someone sweeping the cloister walk. You rise, joints creaking, in protest, and begin the morning ritual. Cold water in a bowl, splash to the face, an involuntary gasp. You mutter a sleepy prayer to Saint Lactantius, not for divine inspiration, but to make it through breakfast without sneezing into the peppered curds. Today is not just another day of mending cheesecloth and inspecting rinds. Today you've been asked to assist Brother Eustace in organizing the monastery's inventory of cheese-related tools, relics, and written references. In theory, this sounds dull. In practice, it is a treasure hunt disguised as clerical drudgery. Follow Eustace down a narrow staircase into a dim archive chamber lined with wooden chests, scroll racks, and a number of spider webs that seem to have taken vows of silence. He's already elbow-deep in a crate of brass cheese stamps, each one marked with a symbol, stars, fleur-de-lis, a unicorn that has definitely seen better days. Mainstream historical fact: cheese stamps were used by monasteries and noble households, alike to mark ownership or origin of cheese wheels, an early form of branding before foil labels or wax seals. Some even use stamps shaped like coats of arms or saint sigils. Eustace hands you a bundle of folded parchment. See what's in here. Could be receipts, could be heresy, always a gamble. You open one and find an elegantly inked sketch. of a cheese press powered by two rotating wooden arms and something that looks suspiciously like a squirrel on a wheel. There are notes in Latin, mostly complaints about the squirrel's work ethic. Quirky tidbit. One 13th century abbey experimented with rodent-powered cheese presses. The results were mixed fast production, but with a high risk of chewed ropes and missing ingredients. As you sort through the documents, you discover a vellum-bound book labeled Liber Lactorius, or the Milk Book. It's part prayer, part recipe collection, and part philosophical musing on the spiritual patience of curd. Brother Eustace refers to it as the slowest page-turner in Christendom, but you find it oddly comforting. There's something quietly powerful about monks, who viewed dairy as both sustenance and sacrament. Historians still argue whether these books were meant for public distribution or kept strictly within the cloister walls. Some bear illuminations, so ornate they resemble high art, with cheese wheels haloed in gold leaf and cows rendered with improbable grace. Others are scrawled in plain ink with side notes like, "Remember to thank Sister Joan for the rennet again." You come across a wooden crate labeled Obsolete Implements. Inside, a cracked wooden curd ladle, a rusted brine trough, a cheesecloth roller that resembles a miniature drawbridge, and a small, strange device that looks like a fork welded to a door hinge. "What is this?" you ask. Eustace peers over. "That's the portable rind poke of St. Hubert. Total nonsense. Poked more monks than cheeses." You hold it up. It wobbles ominously. Together, you begin cataloging the items. Not just what they are, but their histories, when they were used, who wielded them, what disasters they caused. Like the great brine spill of 1179, when a barrel burst and flooded the lower chapel, briefly making it the holiest place to slip and fall in England. You pause at a dusty scroll tucked behind a box. Carefully, you unroll it. The ink has faded, but you can just make out a recipe for a cheese made with crushed violets and rosemary, written in a looping, delicate hand. There's a wax seal at the bottom, a rose with tiny initials. MT. Brother Eustace peers over your shoulder. Marjorie of Thorn Abbey. Legend has it she invented 4 different cheeses and accidentally set fire to a dairy with a candle and a very flammable rind. You smile. "We should bring this one back," Eustace grunts. "Only if you promise not to set anything on fire." You spend the rest of the morning assembling a list of cheeses of interest, which includes such gems as the singing brie, melts at room temperature and allegedly hums. Pilgrim's pickle rind, aged in onion skins and best not discussed. Blessed. Edric's wheel, once won 3rd place at the county feast despite being mostly rind and desperation. By noon, your fingers are smudged with ink, your back is sore, and you've developed a strange fondness for the tools of your trade. You've handled butter stamps shaped like saints, brushes made of horsehair for washing cheese rinds, and a small wooden cow wearing spectacles, no one knows why. But it lives on top of the shelf now. You close the crate gently, hands lingering on the lid. These aren't just objects. They're memory keepers. Tangible reminders that for centuries, monks like you have leaned into the strange beauty of dairy, discipline, and divine curiosity. You look over at Eustace, who is now attempting to label ladle using an inkpot and the side of his thumb. You. "No," he says without looking up. "When I joined the monastery, I didn't think I'd spend my life writing sonnets to coagulation." You grin. You just haven't met the right cheese yet. Outside, the bells ring for sext, time to return to the world of prayer and pasture. But part of you remains here among the cheese stamps and squirrel sketches, warmed by the quiet hum of history and the knowledge that somewhere in this old stone room someone once believed cheese could sing, and honestly, you kind of believe it too. After the noon bells fade into silence, you step back into the light, blinking like a mole that's been reading cheese poetry underground. The sun has decided finally to grace the cloister with a watery half-smile. You stretch your arms, rotate your shoulder, and almost dislodge Trevor the pebble from your boot. Almost. Lunch is waiting in the refectory, a quiet affair of bread, root vegetables, and of course, a small wedge of that herb-flecked soft cheese the kitchen's been working on. It's mild, a little nutty, with a finish that tastes suspiciously of parsnip. But no one complains. In fact, you hear a polite murmur ripple through the monks like wind through barley. Quite agreeable, rather seasonal, and one daring soul whispering, might pair with rose hips. You eat in silence, as is the custom, though your mind is far from still. You keep thinking of the tools, the scrolls, the whispered names of cheeses long lost. And now, your duties for the afternoon will take you somewhere entirely different. The herb garden. Because cheese doesn't just happen. It's coaxed, and coddled by more than milk and rennet. There are the aging rooms, the salt barrels, the careful wrappings. But just as vital are the herbs: thyme, sage, rosemary, chives planted, harvested, and dried for blending into recipes that blur the line between meal and medicine. Mainstream. Historical fact. Medieval monasteries cultivated large herb gardens not only for medicinal purposes, but also to flavor food and preserve perishables. Cheese infused with herbs was not only tastier, but sometimes longer lasting, especially during warmer months. You head out toward the far wall, where the kitchen garden unfurls in neat rows like a green manuscript. Brother Gregory is all ready. There, knelt beside a patch of marjoram, his robe hitched up just enough to show patched socks and pale knees. He looks up and smiles. Ready for battle? He asks, waving a trowel. Only if the weeds are unarmed. You kneel beside him and begin gently trimming a patch of lavender, careful to avoid the bees that hum like tiny monks in striped habits. The scent is immediate, clean, floral, grounding. You rub a bit between your fingers and imagine it woven into a soft goat cheese, served on warm bread in some imaginary summer garden. Quirky tidbit. Some monastic orders experimented with aromatic cheeses meant not only to taste pleasant but to scent entire rooms. These rarely caught on, though one abbey reportedly used a lavender wheel to keep moths away from linens. Gregory hands you a sack and points to the rows. We need sage, thyme, and a bit of sweet Sicily. It's for the green cheese trial tomorrow. Also, try not to confuse the tansy with the feverfew again. I only did that once. Twice. Once with enthusiasm. You work in easy silence, the kind that only comes from years of shared chores and mutual weeding. Every so often, a breeze stirs the hedgerows, and the bells from a distant pasture drift in dull, contented cow chimes that sound like they've got nowhere urgent to be. Historians still argue whether herbal blends in monastic cheeses were primarily for preservation, medicinal effect, or simply to mask poor milk quality. Some texts suggest elaborate theories of cheese temperaments, matching herbs to humors, while others read like flavored diaries. Cheese number 12, too much sage. Cheese number 13, thyme divine. Cheese number 14, why is it blue? At the edge of the garden stands a low stone shed, half covered in moss, where the drying racks are kept. Inside, bundles of herbs hang like upside-down monks in green robes, scenting the air with the combined perfume of 5 seasons. You step in and feel time slow. Each row of hanging bundles bears a tiny wooden tag. Some are scrawled with abbreviations. TR for tooth remedy, GC for green cheese, SAR for sore ribs. Gregory explains in a whisper, as if the herbs themselves are sleeping. He shows you the cheesecloth infusion technique. A soft fabric pouch, stuffed with dried mint and elderflower, is steeped in whey before being pressed into the curds. The result? A gently perfumed cheese that tastes like early spring. You nod, impressed. Do you think it works? Gregory shrugs. Some say it's healing. Others say it's nonsense. I just think it's nice. You gather your cuttings and hang them to dry, each one a thread in the long, invisible rope that ties this place together. A monastery, yes. A holy site. But also a kitchen, a garden, a laboratory of the edible and ephemeral. You pass a sundial on your way back, and for once, you're grateful for the sun's cooperation. Its shadow marks the hour neatly, as if to say, yes, it is mid-afternoon. And no, you're not running late. Back inside, you're sent to the small preparation table in the corner of the cheese room, the jeer bench, as it's affectionately called. You begin mixing the dried sage and thyme into a bowl of fresh curds. The aroma is warm and sharp, the curds soft and pliable under your wooden spoon. You press them gently into a small cloth-lined mold and weigh it down with a smooth river stone. You watch it settle. The herbs swirl just beneath the surface like green brushstrokes. You wonder what this cheese will be named. They always get names, sometimes poetic, sometimes ironic, like St. Crispin's regret or Brother Osric's surprise. You're still not sure what surprised him. The cheese will age in the cellar, wrapped in cloth soaked in cider. Vinegar. It will turn golden at the edges and develop a rind that crackles like old parchment. You will try it in 3 weeks, and it will taste faintly of memory. You glance up. Gregory's left a single sprig of rosemary on your bench. A silent signature. Or maybe just his way of saying good job without wasting words. You smile. Cheese and herbs. Patience and practice. This is what keeps the monastery turning, not grand miracles or fire and brimstone sermons, but soft curds and careful flavor. The sun slants through the high windows. Dust motes drift like lazy bees. And somewhere below your feet, a cheese is beginning to bloom. Evening finds you back in the cellar. The heavy door groans shut behind you, and instantly the air changes cooler, denser, tinged with the scent of salt and slow decay. Not unpleasant, though. Just aged, like the breath of time itself. You descend the stone steps carefully, your boots tapping in a rhythm that echoes softly off the walls. The light from your lantern flickers, brushing over wooden shelves and stacked wheels of cheese that look, in the dimness, like ancient tomes in a forgotten library. You've come to turn the cheeses, not metaphorically, though a fair number of. Monks might argue cheese turning is a deeply meditative act, akin to contemplation or prayer. No, this is a practical task. If left untouched, a cheese ages unevenly. One side dries too quickly, the other too damp. Rinds crack. Mold misbehaves. Turning keeps them honest. Mainstream historical fact. In medieval monastic dairies, cheese wheels were regularly turned daily at first, then weekly as part of their aging process. The turning helped prevent spoilage, distribute moisture, and maintain a uniform texture. You crouch beside the aging shelves. Each wheel rests on a square of straw matting labeled with a small wooden tag, most of them in Latin abbreviations that you've long since memorized. Peaky, pressed curd. C.S. cider soaked. L.A. lavender aged. And a mysterious R.A. that Brother Tiberius insists stands for righteous ambrosia, but may just be red algae. You take up the first wheel, a firm, dry round with a mottled gray rind. It creaks slightly as you lift it, resisting like an elderly tortoise. With both hands, you rotate it halfway, then set it down with care. The process repeats. Turn, set, slide to the back. Move to the next. The cellar hums with its own quiet energy. Some of the wheels are practically buzzing with the activity of benign molds, blooming, crusting, forming flavor. You pause by a particularly lively blue-veined specimen and admire its ambition. Quirky tidbit. certain monastic cheeses were known to harbor cheese mites, tiny arthropods that, while alarming to modern sensibilities, were seen as beneficial in ripening certain types of hard rind cheeses. Some monks even believed their presence indicated divine favor, or at least extra flavor. You lean closer to a wheel that smells distinctly of mushrooms and candle wax. It's a washed rind cheese, bathed weekly in brine, ale, or, in one famously divisive trial mead. The result was pungent enough to clear the scriptorium during a stormy January. That batch was quietly buried under the herb garden. You've never confirmed if it was for the garden's benefit, or the abbey's nose. Historians still argue whether certain aging techniques were deliberate or the accidental consequence of medieval storage conditions. Cellars like these weren't always temperature stable. Some relied on proximity to wells, shaded courtyards, or just particularly chilly monks. Whether cheese turned out sharp or mellow sometimes depended more on the weather than the recipe. Adjust a stack of soft ripened rounds resting under muslin. These are the delicate ones, babies, really. High maintenance, quick to spoil, quick to impress. Their rinds are soft and white like fine bloom, but they bruise easily. You brush one gently with a goose feather. Brother Matthias insists it improves the rind texture. You suspect he just likes feathers. In the far corner of the cellar, the experimental shelf awaits. This is where the oddballs live. The cheeses no one quite agrees on. Some are soaked in spiced wine, others layered with roasted garlic. One, terrifyingly, was made with crushed nettles and a pinch of dried plum. You've labeled it, do not trust. But experimentation is part of monastic life. It's what turns simple food into something extraordinary. You remember Brother Osric's proudest moment, a double cream blue cheese cured in birch bark, aged for 4 months under a bell. For tone, he claimed. It tasted like bravery and regret. You move from shelf to shelf, your lantern casting long shadows as the cheeses gleam faintly in their rinds. Some have cracked, some have bloomed. A few have been partially nibbled, whether by mice or other monks. Remains open to interpretation. You take a moment to sit on an overturned cask and simply breathe. The cellar is quiet, but not silent. You hear the distant drip of water, the creak of old wood, the soft exhale of fermentation in motion. It's a stillness that works, never sleeping, always turning, always aging towards something. Your fingers itch with the salt of brined wheels. Your back protests a little, but it's the good kind of ache, the one that comes with purpose. You recall, not for the first time, that the word cellar shares roots with cellari, to hide. And indeed, here in this cold chamber beneath a monastery, things are hidden cheeses. Secrets, time itself. What goes in as milk returns as memory. Before you leave, you check the cloth-wrapped rounds maturing on the bottom shelf. These are destined for the festival table, a seasonal spread of breads, fruits, ale, and naturally, the abbey's proudest wheels. The cloth is damp with vinegar and ash. The smell is strong but clean. You nod, satisfied. The bell above sounds. The hour. You rise, stretch, and whisper a soft apology to your knees. The cheeses do not reply, but they don't need to. They are busy becoming themselves. As you climb the stairs, you carry with you the scent of straw and salt, and a small crumb of something firm and golden tucked in your pocket. Just a taste. For later. And maybe, you think as you close the cellar door behind you, just maybe, that's what all this is for. Not glory. Not wealth. But the quiet pleasure of cheese in its season, made with care, aged with patience, and shared among those who understand that life, like cheese, is best when it's allowed to ripen slowly. Night has settled over the monastery, not the dramatic kind of night. No thunderclaps, no howling wolves, no sudden candle going out with a hiss. Just the soft, velvety kind where the wind shifts low through the trees and the moon spills herself shyly over the cloister garden. You walk slowly, your boots quieter now, as though the path itself asks for a little peace. The day's chores are done. The parchment has been cleaned, the ink pot's corked, and the cheese dear, humble cheese is, now safely aging in the cellar, doing what it does best. Becoming better with time and silence. Up ahead, the chapel door is ajar. Inside, a handful of monks murmur evening prayers, their voices a low, rhythmic weave in Latin, echoing like the coo of old doves. You step past without entering, out of respect, and partly because your stomach has begun a small but impassioned protest about the lack of dinner. You follow the scent, through the refectory doors, past rows of plain wooden benches. There's a table near the hearth where a few wedges of cheese have been quietly staged, no fanfare, no labels. Just humble offerings on wooden boards. A firm, crumbly yellow with a sharp edge like a rebuke. A soft, mild white, flecked with chives. A pungent blue that somehow smells of both tree bark and victory. There is also bread. And a small crock of honey. And the remains of a pear, neatly sliced. You sit. Mainstream historical fact. Monks in medieval Europe commonly consumed cheese at supper, especially during fasting periods when meat was forbidden. Cheese, along with bread, was a key protein source and often shared communally in silence. You break off a piece of bread, spread a soft, mild cheese across it, and take a bite. It's perfect, not because it's expensive or famous or blessed by the Pope, though Brother Peter did joke about writing a papal request for cheese canonization once, but because it was made with care. Every part of it carries a story. The milking, the stirring, the salt, the patient waiting, the careful turning in a cool, damp cellar. It's humble food that's anything but simple. Quirky tidbit. In some abbeys, monks name their cheeses. Not publicly, of course there are rules, but quietly, as if each wheel were a friend or pupil. Brother Anselm reportedly had a soft-ripened brie he called Augustine, and once lost sleep when mice invaded its shelf. The fire crackles gently beside you. You pull your scarf tighter, more from habit than need, and chew slowly. Time stretches. Somewhere, a dog barks, distant and unbothered. The cheese melts in your mouth with that rich, slightly nutty finish that only happens when everything goes right. Historians still argue whether cheese held symbolic value in monastic life or was simply a culinary staple. Some point to biblical references to curds and milk as signs of divine provision. Others argue it was just practical protein with a decent shelf life. Either way, it mattered. Deeply. You finish the bread, then reach for a small, sharp wedge. This one bites back tangy, intense, almost fizzy. You laugh softly. It's like a sermon in your mouth. Bold, challenging, lingering well after it's done. The candle at your table flickers lower. You lean back, hands resting in your lap, your belly pleasantly full of fermented dairy, your soul warmed by routine and ritual and just enough chaos to keep things interesting. Like the cheese made with nettles, or the note about delivering a wheel only if the recipient smiled. These little interruptions are what make the whole thing human. And now, at the end of this long, curdled, blessedly ridiculous journey, you understand what medieval monks knew all along. That cheese, like prayer, like sleep, is about surrender. To time, to stillness, to letting things take their course. One quiet hour at a time. You're still at the table, the fire low, the last ember glowing like a sleepy eye beneath the ash. The monastery around you hums with stillness. Somewhere far off, a bell will ring again. But not now. For now, all is calm. Your hands are folded across your middle, a soft ache in your shoulders, your knees reminding you gently of the stairs, the cellar, the turning of wheels. It's a good ache, honest, earned. The last sliver of cheese is gone, but you can still taste it sharp, warm, patient. A memory in your mouth. Above, the rafters creak as the wind nudges past. It's gentle. Everything is gentle now. The night. The fire. Even your thoughts, which drift like steam. Across a bowl of soup. Nothing pressing, nothing loud. Just images of wheels stacked like golden suns, of monks in woolen habits smiling behind baskets, of parchment scribbled with strange, affectionate notes. You feel your eyelids lower, slowly, like shutters drawn, against the world. And you welcome the dark. You've walked a long road tonight, not just through the village or the pasture or the cool stone corridors of the abbey, but through time itself. Through curd and cloth, through brine and brotherhood. And now it's time to rest. Let the cheese age a little longer. Let the cellar hold its cool breath. Let the candle gutter and fade. You did well. You listened. You turned the wheels. You delivered what mattered. And now, dear listener, sleep.